Just take me off the screen then, there's no point. Is that okay?
Okay. Okay, hi everyone. So that's us live. Thank you so much for coming to this EIS Equality Hustings. We're very pleased to have the major political parties represented here today. The EIS, as you know, have a long-standing commitment to equality. And during this time, that commitment has only strengthened as we've seen that COVID-19 has not affected us all equally and has indeed had a disproportionate impact on marginalised groups. The EIS is strongly committed to a fairer, more just Scotland and believes the journey towards that begins in our education system. So our election manifesto calls for an investment in education for equity and for our prioritisation of equality in terms of creating safe, inclusive and non-discriminatory environments for all staff and students. So this event will explore some of the key equality areas that the EIS are concerned around our members, but we've taken care to not introduce topics that have already been thoroughly covered by the main EIS Hustings events, such as questions pertaining to ASN, teacher recruitment and resourcing, although of course there will be a lot of crossover. A recording of the main Hustings event is available online for those of you who are interested in viewing that. Now, the hashtag for this event is hashtag EIS Equality Hustings, so please do join the conversation on Twitter. I'll move on now to invite all speakers to introduce themselves and briefly, please outline your party's key policies on equality matters. So it's 3 minutes max, please, and the order of this and the questions to follow has been randomly drawn. So first of all, can I please invite Karen Lindsay, Equality spokesperson for Scottish Liberal Democrats, to provide her opening statements.
Thank you. Scottish Liberal Democrats have education and equality at the very heart of our plans to put recovery first. Our Bounce Back plan offers unprecedented new entitlements for pupils and staff and extra resources in every school. And that means a fee for every teacher, ending the casualisation of the teaching workforce. It means more pupil support assistance, an outdoor learning guarantee for residential, the abolition of fees for young people to use over the holidays so nobody misses out on activities. And we're doing this because we know that education is the most important factors in tackling poverty and reducing inequality. We're not prepared to wait until this generation's grandchildren are at school to close the gap. We've already won an extra £80 million for education and more for the Pupil Equity Fund too. It's a Dem idea in the first place, and we're going to make this funding permanent. And we'll also make sure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds benefit from our nursery premium, as well as ensuring that all 2-year-olds benefit from the 1,140 hours of childcare. And we'll raise the starting age for formal schooling to 7, transforming how children learn in what is currently P1 and P2 so that it's truly play-based. Extending universal free school meals to all primary school children, especially everything payment to £20, will go all scandalous levels of child poverty. 58% of teachers said they recommend the profession.
Sorry, Karen,
and stresses have only increased since then. Oops.
Sorry, Karen, you cut out there
okay,
in the
is
end.
that better?
I think that's a wee bit better. Sorry, just go back to your
okay,
last
can
sentence,
you hear me now?
please.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So
No, sorry, it's cut out
well,
again there for Karen. Can we come back to Karen's statement, please, just in hope that the connection will have improved? Is that okay? We can come back to half of your statement and then move on for just now.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll just move on to Scottish Labour, Michael Mara, spokesperson for Education and Skills.
Thank you, Selma, and thank you to the EIS for inviting me along this evening to speak on behalf of Scottish Labour. I'm Michael Mara. I am a councillor in Dundee, but I am also one of Labour's candidates for the North East list, for the regional list. I am Labour's education and skills spokesperson for Scotland. So I really welcome this discussion this evening. Equality is one of Labour's founding principles. We exist to create a more equal society in Scotland, across the UK and across the world. And I know that that's right at the heart in terms of the EIS's principles, and not just in an abstract way, but very much the actions that you and your members take on a day-to-day basis in serving our communities. Can I start by thanking you for your service over the last year, all of your members, for the work that you've done in the most challenging of circumstances. It's been an extraordinarily difficult time. I know that there will be members attending tonight who have been shielding over the last year due to health conditions or disability, and for them to continue to work in those circumstances, educating our young people, whether it be in school or in colleges, will have been extra challenging given all the anxieties and challenges that have come with that. And that is, so thank you again for that service and for keeping our education system on the road. We know that the pandemic has had a huge impact on the broader issue of equality. We know that the impact of the pandemic has been most particular for the most vulnerable, the poorest in our society, but also members of ethnic minorities who have suffered disproportionately from the health effects. So we know that the impact on our education system more broadly has affected the poorest the most, and we have to make sure that we can put the resources in to address those issues of equity if we're going to produce the more equal society that we hope to do, but if we're going to recover from where we are. So Labour has put in place an education comeback plan that is tailored to be tailored using personal comeback plans for every pupil in Scotland to try and address their particular issues. That will include personal tuition in small groups or individuals to make sure that we can support our young people and our learners in recovering over the last year. This is an unprecedented loss of education we've seen over the last year, and the scale of that challenge is absolutely huge. We really welcome the Arshad report that came out recently that signals what needs to be done, but also what education and educators can do to address systemic issues of racism, inequality in our society. We also need to do much more to tackle issues of homophobia and inclusion for our LGBTI community. So I look forward to the questions and the discussion this evening. Thanks for having us along.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, over now to the SNP, Rosa Sally.
Hello, thanks for having me. I would like to thank the extraordinary work of school staff have been doing during the pandemic and rapidly adapting to the lockdown, providing online resources to students and learning models. It has been a really tough year. Diversity and equality is at the heart of the SNP policies, and we are underpinning school education in schools. Education, our vision for Scotland is a global leader in diversity and inclusion to increase fairness and equality and to remove societal disadvantages. We are determined to play our part in eradicating racism, inequality, and injustice, and building a better, fairer world. And we have played a big part into increasing representation in our party. Also, we have developed an ethnic pay gap strategy to go alongside our existing strategies on disability and gender pay. I would like to, sorry, I didn't know actually I had to speak for 3 minutes at the beginning, but that's our key policies and education in Scotland. We are actually trying to add the Black history, decolonizing the curriculum, which is something that I am, as a candidate, very interested to develop if I'm elected to the Scottish Parliament, and bringing equality and diversity into our education system. And I think that's a very important part of our fight against institutional racism and eradicating that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. So next we have Scottish Greens, Ross Greer, please.
Thank you. Apologies, I'm just moving tabs around on my machine. There we are. Thanks very much for having me, everyone. My name's Ross Greer. I'm the education spokesperson for the Scottish Greens, and I was a member of the Parliament's Education Committee in the last session. As I hope a lot of EIS members watching this know, where others were entertaining dangerous conspiracy theorists during the pandemic in the last year, the Greens have stood up for teachers and for school staff and college and university lecturers throughout the pandemic. So, for example, as a result of our Safer Schools proposals being passed by Parliament, regular COVID testing is now on offer to every member of school staff and senior pupils. £45 million was also made available to recruit additional staff for the remainder of this term. We consistently, myself and our health spokesperson Alison Johnson, raised the concerns of BAME, disabled and clinically vulnerable teachers in particular. We pushed for risk assessments and for them not to forget staff who were people of colour in particular, given what appears to be the increased risk. We advocated very strongly for priority vaccination for teachers. And unfortunately, we didn't win that argument overall, but we did at least make progress on the one key group of school staff that we thought really deserved priority, which was those who work with children with complex additional support needs. So we were glad to be able to win at least some progress on priority vaccination for education staff. The Greens are committed to a radical and an intersectional equality agenda. The first thing that I secured after I was elected to Parliament in 2016 was a review of how we do personal and social education in our schools, looking specifically at sex and relationship education with a view to improving that on a consent-based model and to tackling rape culture and violence against women and girls, not just in our schools, but across wider society. Much of our focus in recent years as a party has been supporting pupils with additional needs, including disabled children. We know in Scotland that we have a policy of mainstreaming that does not automatically result in inclusion for children with additional needs. So the Greens, for example, secured a review of coordinated support plans, the only statutory plan that's available where children and their families have a right to recourse to defend the support that they should be getting when they've not received it. They almost completely disappeared. So I was proud that we were able to do that. Of course, we passed the Equal Protection Bill, giving children equal protection for assault. We're proposing that Scotland goes much further by enshrining the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into Scots law. And we're really interested in how we could set up a commissioner to defend the rights of disabled people, neurodiverse people, and others. We have a long commitment to racial justice as the Scottish Greens. We won the first vote in Parliament to give refugees the right to vote, something that I'm delighted to say is the case in this election. We want to go further and extend that to asylum seekers. We've been heavily involved in campaigns against dawn raids and deportations. And last year, we passed a proposal to set up a national slavery museum in Scotland. Because like others, we want to make sure that we've decolonised our curriculum, make sure that all of our young people know the reality of racism in Scotland, past and present. With that, I've probably ran over time, but really excited to get into the detail of this as we move forward into questions.
Just about on time there, Ross. Thank you. So over to our last speaker for introduction here, Scottish Conservatives, Jeremy Balfour, please.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having me. But also, can I thank you, and not just as a politician, but as a parent, for all that you have done over the last 14 months. You have gone beyond all our expectations in regard to what you have done and provided at nursery, at primary school, at secondary, and in colleges. And we, as a nation, owe you a grateful thanks. I'm sure you have learned things about yourself and the skills that you've developed over the last 14 months. And hopefully there will be some positive lessons that we can learn going forward as well. I suppose for me that there are two groups that I would want to address briefly tonight. That is, firstly, how do we have more equality for our young folk and for our children, whether that is in regard to race or disability or gender or the other protected characteristics. What is clear is that what has happened in the last 5 years is that those in our most vulnerable groupings, the attainment gap has got larger than it was 5 years ago. And that's one thing that we need to address in the next Parliament, and the government needs to address urgently. It cannot go on that this gap has grown larger and larger, and we are leaving vulnerable and children behind in regard to that. And that is to do with resources. It's making sure we have enough money, enough teachers, and enough facilities so that you are able to do the job that you are very equipped to do. We need to have a look at the issue around disability and mainstreaming. And have we got that balance right? Have we gone, and are we looking at each child rather than just following a policy by the letter, rather than saying what works for each child? We too support the implementation of a museum to explore in an appropriate way the whole issue of what happened in regard to the empire and in regard to the whole Black people coming to this country and how they were treated. So those are really key issues for our children and young people. But also we have to look at the question of equality for you as teachers. Are we making our schools a place that you want to work in? Do we have the right policies there so that you can be all that you are and achieve all that you want? I think often it is working well, and I think there are many good examples of schools delivering at the local level. But again, around issues of training on some of the protected characteristics, we need to do more, and we need to keep doing the training, not just do it once in a lifetime, but do it regularly. So, like others, I look forward to engagement, listening to your questions, and being with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to all speakers for being here today. We'll move on now to questions on some key equality areas for the EIS. So the first area that we're introducing here is anti-racism in education. So when surveyed in 2018, a significant majority, 71% or nearly 3/4 of all BAME EIS respondents to the survey had experienced racism in their capacity as a teacher or lecturer, mainly from learners, but also from colleagues, and near half had been overlooked for promotion. So our questions on this topic will be taken together, and they are from Asif Chisti and Nusrat Utmani, who have pre-recorded their questions.
My name is Asif. I'm an EIS Equality Rep. Recent findings from the education sector continue to show that BAME lecturers and teachers, pupils and students face barriers and racism throughout their career or throughout their education. So, what specific measures will your party take to protect and support BAME learners and BAME teachers and lecturers? And what will your party do to dismantle institutional racism? And will you confirm today whether you personally believe that institutional racism exists in this country?
We'll take the next question now as well, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Nusrat Uthmani, and I'm here representing the EIS's BAME network. I view the need to protect our pupils and staff in education from racism and discrimination as a human right. Would the panelists agree that anti-racist training, not just unconscious bias training, should be made mandatory, especially in education, health and social services, to help raise awareness and promote racial literacy? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions to Asif, who is the chair of the Anti-Racist Subcommittee at the EIS, and Nusrat, who is a member of the EIS BAME network, who has submitted that question in a personal capacity. So speakers have been randomly drawn to answer this question. You have 3 minutes to answer these 2 questions. So the first one, institutional racism, and the second on anti-racist training. So the first up is Conservatives. Jeremy, you have 3 minutes, please.
Can I thank both individuals for their questions? And if I can take the second one first and say, absolutely, we do need more training. We need more training in our colleges, so when people are doing their teacher training, but we also need in service days around this as well. And I would want to see a much more regular training program around racism, around disability, around all these protected characteristics. And I think it's a conversation that the Scottish Government, whoever they are next week, has to have with COSLA, and there needs to be the same kind of work that is done across Scotland. It's not acceptable that some good training is happening in some parts of Scotland and not happening in others, and we need to make sure that all 32 local authorities are doing it appropriately. In regard to the first question, I think there is still institutional racism. I think school is a reflection of where society is and how society needs to be challenged on this issue. I am not sure we need to pass lots more legislation around this. What we need to do is actually get the legislation properly enforced. And that means giving individuals the ability to challenge these decisions under the legal framework that is already there around employment law. And so I think that is being able to discuss it, being able to feel able to go and challenge decisions which are clearly wrong. And as a society and within our schools, we need to talk about this. I would finish with a slightly more positive thing to say. I think we have a long way to go. But as someone who was educated back in the 80s, we have come a massive way, but we still got that journey to go. So I think we can say we're making progress, but we need to make more progress, which sounds really a bit like my school reports.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, for your answer. So over to Karen now. Lib Dems, you have 3 minutes to answer these 2 questions.
Thanks to Asif and Nusrat for great questions. We've got 2 pieces of research that I kind of want to share with you that the Scottish Lib Dems did. The first was about we did some research in 2018 into diversity within teaching, and out of 2,000 schools, over 19 councils, we found only 2 BAME head teachers and 2 BAME deputy head teachers, and that is no way good enough. So I think part of that Macron 2 a review that we want to carry out is going to have to look at those kind of barriers within the profession, and that involves listening to the experience of racism that teachers are facing. It's so important to take that seriously, and I do absolutely accept that there's institutional racism, not only in education but in many areas in our country, and we really do have to deal with that. And the fact that it does actually matter that we don't have BAME people in senior positions. I mean, our whole outlook in life is kind of shaped during our school years, and the lack of role models in schools and the long-standing lack of diversity amongst teaching staff is extremely concerning. And we actually need the talents of everyone for education to help children really kind of bounce back. The other piece of research that we did was in bullying, and we discovered that there were something like 2,200 incidents of racist bullying reported over a 3-year period. And, you know, that's only the ones that are being reported. The fact that we found these thousands of incidents is an indication that, you know, many teachers do feel able to respond and act, but we need to recognise that underreporting is always a problem with these things. So there needs to be a big focus in reassuring children that they're going to be heard if they report bullying. And I really was interested in Nuzhat's question about anti-racist training. Absolutely right, not just unconscious bias training, because that does not necessarily give you the information, doesn't prepare you for being kind of culturally sensitive. One of the things that I found really useful is that, you know, within our party, the Black Dems produced a really helpful guide to kind of microaggressions, things that people should avoid. And we actually need to be more explicit about saying about producing things like that, I think, and make sure that the training is done by you know, and developed by people from ethnic minorities themselves, and being involved in designing and delivering that training. You know, I think as well, changing the curriculum, as others have talked about Scotland's role in empire and slavery and things like that.
That's time,
so
Karen.
important. And the earlier, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Karen. That's time. Sorry, I hate to cut people off, but we're short on time today. Can I just remind speakers that the questions pertain to specific measures that your party will take to introduce support and protections for BAME teachers, lecturers, pupils and students, dismantle institutional racism, and if you agree that anti-racist training, not unconscious bias training, should be mandatory. I'm repeating that because we're having an issue with the questions on the screen. So the next 3-minute input then from Michael, please, Scottish Labour.
Thanks, Elma. Thanks to both the questioners. So in short, yes, I do believe, and the Labour Party believes, that institutional racism does exist in our society, in Scotland and across the UK. I would say that it's not enough to recognise that. We have to be actively anti-racist in what we do and the way that we act. So the point of having training is not just so that people can recognise it, but so people can act and feel empowered to act when they identify issues of racism and discrimination. And in our manifesto, we have committed to practical support for teachers to deliver pro-equality, equitable, anti-racist, anti-sexist and anti-homophobic education. So we absolutely want to support the TIE campaign further in terms of their introduction of rolling out further that kind of anti-discriminatory education and helping teachers to access materials and development for themselves. So that they can become active anti-racists in their practice, and we think that should be at the heart of our approach in the future. We do believe that there more needs to be done around issues of promotion and diversification, and we have committed to a redoubling of efforts in those areas, and we would wish to work with the EIS and the committees that both our questioners come from to see what more can be done in those areas. And as I mentioned before, I think the Arshad report has points some of the direction, the actions that might be taken, and certainly begins to set out the scale of the challenge that is faced. I think more broadly within this, in terms of an anti-racist culture, we need to work, and Karen touched on it briefly there, about decolonising the curriculum. We need to make sure that we acknowledge our history as Scots, as one of the greatest perpetrators and beneficiaries of empire and colonialism, and the systemic racism that underpinned that power structure. And we need to make sure that we recognise that very publicly. I would agree with Jeremy that I think that we've come a distance in some of that, and that conversation is just beginning in Scotland. But frankly, even 10 years ago, I would say it was not recognised as a mainstream position, and I'm glad that our conversation nationally is moving in that direction. But as Jeremy said, there is still so much more to do.
Thanks very much, Michael. So the next speaker is Rosa, SNP. Please, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Great questions, and I am 100% with the idea. I think it was Nuzhit who asked that question about training. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement has shone a powerful spotlight on racial injustice and race inequality. And that our countries have to really look into the history and the past and decolonizing the curriculum, which is so important that we know our history and is not only written by, we don't study only the white history. Many councils we're encouraging to adopt the decolonization of the curriculum practices and embracing global citizenship learning and teaching. The Scottish National Party are committing to fund development of an online program in Scotland to decolonize the history and in the curriculum. But also, I think in the success of the Thai campaign is also going to be used as a model for wider equality learning and teaching. So we will create a new program of anti-racist education in school, including support for teachers and professional development, allowing every school to access high-quality anti-racist education to track progress. And I think that would be a great step forward on training and anti-racist education. We have to deliver also inclusive education, as I mentioned. But there has been many works, and we acknowledge there is underrepresentation of BME teachers, and we know we have to we have carried out a BME teachers. I think they were involved in the process. That model of how to is called Teaching in Diverse Scotland report was published in 2018. The report was commissioned by Professor Rowan Arshad. Basically, the Deputy First Minister have welcomed the report and fully accept the 17 recommendations from that report. And that would basically bring into diversity into our teaching and in our education. So there's a lot of work being done. And of course, bullying based on race is unacceptable. And I think all political parties agrees on that. We, the Scottish Government, have actually funded the Respect Me, our national anti-bullying service, working with Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights to produce a resource for school that provides guidance on effectively challenging racism in school. So I think during COVID also we've funded grants.
That's time, Rosa.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, final speaker here, Ross, please, Greens, 3 minutes.
Thank you. And in immediate response to Azif's question, I mean, yes, institutional racism exists, and it's not something that we can solve entirely through our schools. We know that this is a wider societal issue. Schools are hardly, education's hardly the only institution where racism exists in Scotland. And this can't be one of those things where we expect whether it's teachers or lecturers to be miracle workers and solve all of society's ills, though there is, don't get me wrong, a huge amount that we can do. And it goes back to the basics, something that Karen said that I'd like to pick up on around recording instances of racism and racist bullying for what they are. We know this is a huge issue. We know there are massive issues of bullying of any protected characteristic, whether it's racism, whether it's against LGBT people or disabled pupils or staff, that too often this is just put down as generic instances of bullying, and the protected characteristic isn't actually noticed. So we need to follow through on the really good work that the Thai campaign did around making sure that homophobic and transphobic bullying is recorded accurately. That needs to be applied across the board to every protected characteristic, but especially when we're talking about instances of racism. And as much as I would do away in a heartbeat with Scotland's national inspection regime, I think we do need to think about how we factor checking up on this into the inspection regime rather than just hovering over and interfering with what teachers are doing in their classrooms. Yes, we need to decolonize the curriculum. I mentioned that already. Green Manifesto talks about stuff like you're teaching the past accurately. But in terms of career barriers, that, as you've mentioned, well, one thing that we're really interested in looking into is a reserve fund for the creation of promoted posts for BAME teachers in particular. I think if we want to smash through these barriers, I think that is one of the ways that we need to seriously look into it. Taking a step back, we need to look at the barriers to PGD courses for people coming from BAME backgrounds. We need to look at contextualized admissions, anonymized applications, so that we can try and eliminate or at least reduce both conscious and unconscious bias in the university admission process. And one other area that the Greens think is really necessary here is a review of racial awareness in Police Scotland, because some of these instances are serious enough where they could constitute a criminal offence, but in many cases, quite understandably, the victim or the survivor doesn't feel confident in going to the police because they see it as another institution where institutional racism is an issue. I don't want to pass out Nuzit's question before I run out of time. Yes, we would absolutely support proper anti-racist training and that it be mandatory, but it has to be resourced properly, because what we don't want is for it to not be resourced and you end up with, say this, for example, displacing continued learning in areas like additional support needs or like the LGBT training that folk like Ty offer. This needs to be intersectional, which is why resourcing is absolutely key here. That's why the Greens want to increase teacher numbers by 5,500. We want to decrease class contact time. All of this training should be covered, as much of it as possible, in initial teacher education. Can't necessarily do it all thoroughly there. That's why it has to be through continued learning and professional development.
Time, Ross.
Be resourced.
That's time. Okay, thank you very much to all speakers for your contributions for that first theme. So moving on then swiftly to our next theme, which is women's equality. Now, UN Women now estimate that gender equality could have been set back 25 years due to the pandemic and related consequences of the pandemic, such as lockdown. Also, before the pandemic, misogyny and sexual harassment remained rife in all aspects of society, with significant consequences for women and girls. A recent survey of 1,000 women EIS members showed a concerning increase in the disproportionate burden of unpaid care and domestic work during this time, at a significant detriment to women's mental health, equality, and working life. Despite this, our resilient members have continued to deliver education to learners across Scotland during this pandemic. We have 2 questions on this topic from Susan Quinn and Dawn Wilson, please. Can we get those up on the screen?
Hi, I'm Susan Quinn, Local Association Secretary in Glasgow and the Education Convener for the EIS. 77% of EIS members are women. Please outline the key interventions your party will make to improve women's equality, addressing both paid and unpaid work. Thank you.
Can we have the second question as well, please?
Terry Connolly, a member of the EIS Equality Committee. Women and girls continue to face gender inequality in every sphere of life. What will your party do to eradicate misogyny and sexual harassment within educational establishments and wider society? Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Terry. Sorry, I think I said Dawn earlier. That was Terry there for the questions. So before I hand over to speakers, can I just remind speakers that beyond a commitment to the cause that I hope you all share, these questions pertain to outlining the key interventions and actions that your party plans to take. So first of all, can we hear from Greens, please? Ross, 3 minutes for answering these 2 questions.
Thanks very much. I want to go back to something that I mentioned a minute ago to start off with. For me, what is absolutely key here is some really radical reform, continuous improvement in how we deliver sex and relationship education in our schools. You know, when we did the inquiry into this that I mentioned, securing in Parliament, we found huge numbers of young people who just were not getting quality consent-based sex and relationship education. And I don't mean that point as a criticism of teachers. I mean, I'm really passionate about having more dedicated PSE teachers in our school, because I recognise that this can be a difficult and challenging area for teachers, especially if you have gone into secondary teaching as a subject specialist in an area completely unrelated to this. But every single young person should be getting consent-based sex education. If we do not do that, we are not going to tackle rape culture. We are not going to tackle the endemic levels of violence against women and girls in our society. Sex and relationship education should not be taking place unless it is absolutely rooted in the principle of consent. But in too many instances, that just simply hasn't been the case. So we need to keep following through on the improvements that have been made on that in the last couple of years. One other area that the Greens propose in our manifesto is around making gender budgeting mandatory in all public sector budget setting processes. So that would include local authorities and schools. Where this has been pioneered, we've seen some radically different decisions being made around the allocation of budget and resources, because we know that's where a lot of the most powerful and meaningful decisions are being made. And far too often these decisions are being made in either a male-dominated environment or an exclusively male environment, for example, within some senior management teams, particularly at secondary level and within our colleges. So gender budgeting should simply be mandatory within the public sector. And that is a very easy decision for the government to make. On a wider level, there are a range of other issues that we propose in our manifesto. For example, we want to make legal aid available to all survivors of domestic abuse. We want to enshrine the right to anonymity for survivors of sexual crimes in law, because that's not currently the case. There's so much more that we can do here. And again, we shouldn't see whether it's schools, colleges, or universities as being existing in a silo in this. We live in a patriarchal society, and we need to smash the patriarchy at every level and at every opportunity. But I'm going to go back to the PSE point to round off. I cannot emphasize enough how much of a challenge this is if we are not bringing particularly men and boys we're talking about here, every young man should leave school having received sex and relationship education that is rooted in the principle of consent. We should consider it a massive societal failure that quite often young men will get to university and be attending a consent-based workshop during their freshers week, and that's the first time that concept has been directly addressed with them. So there's so much more that we need to do there, right back to those basics.
Thank you, Ross. That was bang on time. Okay, over now to Jeremy. Reminder that the questions is about improving women's inequality, both in paid and unpaid work, and eradicating misogyny and sexual harassment. So we're looking for key interventions and practical solutions here. Over to Jeremy, 3 minutes.
Yep. Again, thank you to the two individuals for their questions. If I'm honest, I'm a lot more interested in this than I was 10 years ago, in that I now have two daughters, twin daughters, who are 10 years old. And so I want to make sure that they are absolutely treated with equality in their education and going on in their life. If I can start with the non-paid stuff, I think that is actually a really key area, because we know that it is predominantly women that do the caring at home, whether that's for family or for relatives. And so we have looked at the carers allowance, and we want to increase that carers allowance to give more money. We want to make it easier for children who are carers, maybe to siblings or to parents themselves, to be able to access that quicker and easier. And also, sadly, if you're caring for somebody and an individual dies, then we would extend that carers allowance for a further 6 months to allow that individual to have the appropriate time to mourn, to maybe retrain, or to then be able to find fresh employment. So I think around that whole caring issue, there is quite a lot of positive stuff that can come forward out of the next Scottish Parliament, and certainly within our manifesto. In regard to the whole issue, again, it is unacceptable, and it's not often I will say this, but I agree with Ross in regard to the issue that there does need to be absolute understanding, particularly by younger males, in regard to what is not acceptable around this. We need our staff, our education department, we need our society in general to be modelling that as well, and it needs to be a societal change. Again, I think a lot of the things that you can do are already there, but they are not being implemented and they're not being used appropriately, either by head teachers or by local authorities. And I think the role for Scottish Government and for opposition MSPs and for actually all MSPs is to make sure that what is already there is being used and is being allowed to be taught in an appropriate way, and also that where people feel they are being discriminated against or where they have been abused, that there is a very clear system going forward in regard to how that can be reported. I was a councillor before becoming an MSP, and we had a real problem here in Edinburgh around the whole issue of how do people report these things in a way that they cannot be anonymously. And the hotline really was a struggle to get going. I think it's working better now. And I think those type of things need to be in every local authority so that women can report it, knowing that they won't, they can do it in a way that is anonymously.
That's time, Jeremy. Thank you. Over to Karen Lebdens, please. You have 3 minutes. Key intervention, women's equality and eradicating misogyny, please.
First of all, in terms of the world of work, many of the areas where women are the majority of the workforce aren't valued enough, aren't paid enough. And one of the prime examples is in the social care sector. So we really are committed to very quick national pay bargaining and proper career development for that sector. More generally, we really want to increase childcare. We want to give the entitlement of the 1,140 hours to all 2-year-olds. That just allows parents to choose the work balance that suits them, and also really contributes to women's equality by enabling them to participate in the workforce. In terms of misogyny and safety, I think we all saw from when Sarah Everard died, just that outpouring anger. Feel safe in the street, and every single person, every single woman had a story to tell of when they had near miss. When I had one myself a few years ago when I was threatened by a man near my home. And so women aren't feeling safe home as domestic violence and domestic abuse has gone up during the pandemic, and often not at work either. So one of the things that I proposed is a commission that looks at ways of ending violence against women and girls in all of its forms, and that would report in the first year of the Scottish Parliament and come up with, a whole suite of measures that we can actually, practical measures that we can take. I mean, we got to look at all sorts of areas. I mean, for example, as when I was housing spokesperson, I introduced a policy of making sure that people within the housing sector were trained to deal with people who may be suffering domestic abuse. And things like the way we plan our streetscapes to make them safer for women. We need to look at things like actually in the justice system, apparently cases that were being summary domestic abuse in January 2020 aren't going to be dealt with until autumn 2021, and that's just not so. There's a whole load of things that we can do, and also I agree with what people have said on mandatory sex ed in all schools on consent, but I think we need to go a bit beyond consent. We need to look at how people should behave well in relationships, and you have to include things like challenging what young men will have seen in online porn, and really sort of making sure that they have realistic expectations of what to expect in a relationship. And I think we have to always include women's organisations in developing that training and that curriculum. But we also, I mean, the original question, the first question also...
That's time, Karen. I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, next speaker, Michael, please. Labour, 3 minutes.
Sorry, I'm just trying. I'm unmuted. Okay, sorry. Yeah, thanks for these questions. I think they're really challenging questions because they are, as Ross pointed out, so wide-ranging in terms of the culture that we live in. About firstly the issue around just discrimination against girls and women. Labour published our manifesto, our women's manifesto, just last week, and we believe that we have to have a women-led recovery. And I'll come on to why specifically around the economic side of that is. But if we're going to do that right, if we're going to make sure that we can achieve those aims, we have to recognise male behaviour within that, and we have to, as men, we have to challenge ourselves, we have to challenge our brothers, our sons, our friends, and about their behaviour and their attitudes. So much of that responsibility lies with us as men, but alongside that, we need to listen to women and to girls about their experiences, and we have to value their voices in our public discourse. And too often that does not happen, and women aren't counted; they're not listened to nearly enough. So we need to, and I think Karen points out some really good pertinent points in terms of the reaction recently to the Sarah Everard murder and the public outrage at that. Labour, in practical terms, around some of those issues, Labour's committed to reviewing issues of safe transport, safe routes, and how we can, for walking, how we can make sure we can support local councils in doing that work appropriately, so that people have confidence to actually be present in the streets in their local environment. We have to make sure that we can support women's aid and make sure that the funding available to them is long-term and stable. In my local area in Dundee, I know that there have been times in the last year where there have been no women's refuge places available at all, essentially waiting lists for that. If a woman makes a decision to leave a violent or abusive relationship, she has to have the option to take that action there and then. It should not be predicated on the availability of funds, and too often those funds have been cut, frankly, by the SNP government, passed down to local authorities, and that is just completely unacceptable when women needs that support. On the issues of the economic impact, and Susan pointed out the majority of EIS members are teachers are women across the key sectors or key workers in care, early years, childcare, nursing, supermarkets. 77% of those people are women, and so many of them are now either on furlough or very threatened in terms of their jobs. We have to make sure our economic recovery is directed and targeted to those people to make sure that we can support them.
That's time, Michael. Thank you. Okay, up next we have Rosa from SNP. You have 3 minutes, please, to answer the 2 questions: key interventions to improve women's equality, paid unpaid work, and what will your party do to eradicate misogyny and sexual harassment, please?
The SNP has a proud record of fighting for gender equality while in government, and we have supported women's aid. And we've also taken action on equal pay to support women returning to workplaces, and the first ever gender balanced cabinet, and the first ever female first minister. So we have a record of representation. And also we have taken action to end period poverty. We've worked hard to tear down barriers, and the baby box, from a woman being a pregnant woman and having children to support them. Also the supplementary care allowance. I think that's so great that we have that in Scotland, and that is something additional to the welfare system we have in place. We have improved healthcare for women, ensure a fairer economy, and improve representation in public artwork. We've created a new 2 million fund for public artwork, which broadens a range of representation. And fair work, I think, is very, very important, and also representation. We have passed the gender representation on public board Scotland bill. That's something that is a new law. It's the first of its kind in the UK, really, to ensure that 50% of representation of women on public bodies, so having more women in leadership roles, but also the fair work for women. 2 million have been funded for the public art, which will create a massive representation of women, and also ethnic minorities, I think, is in that framework. Also in green skills and jobs for the future, we have included women to be to benefit from these projects that are being in place. So we put equality in all our policies, and promoting women entrepreneur, building a women's business center, I think will benefit women as they make a huge contribution to the Scottish economy, but only 20% of the Scottish business base is owned by women. So we are actually supporting women to be involved in women entrepreneurs. Also supporting families. Women especially will be impacted by that when they have miscarriages. So they would have paid leave if once, unfortunately, if that happens, there will be support for that women. So we've taken policies that will support women. The SNP will take forward the action in Equally Safe.
That's time, Rosa.
And thank you.
So sorry, keep cutting people off.
It's just too little.
Thanks. Yes, it's too little time, never enough time. And we're moving on now to the next theme, which is poverty, deprivation, and mental health. So the pandemic will have affected everyone's well-being, but for those facing inequality, the impact has been more adverse. For example, socioeconomically disadvantaged children, young people, and their families are already at significantly higher risk of ill mental health, and many support services have reduced or stopped during the pandemic. The mental health pandemic existed pre-COVID, particularly impacting those already living in deprivation and who have suffered for more than a decade of austerity. Our question here is one question from Georgie Chisholm. Please, can we get that up?
Hi, my name is Georgie Chisholm. I am a temporary primary school teacher in Edinburgh City Council. My question for the panel is, it's currently a post-close lottery in terms of support for many difficulties young people, children and their families face in relation to their mental health. For those with mental health and emotional needs, what will your party do to ensure every child and adult has access to the emotional and mental health support no matter of the postcode, and that the root cause of their mental ill health is tackled?
Thanks so much to Georgie here for the question. Just to challenge the panel members further, we've only got 2 minutes to respond to this question. So can we start off here with Rosa, please, 2 minutes from the SNP.
Yes, so we're improving mental health support, and I think it's very important. During the pandemic, we understand there's a need for that support, and we are going to invest in mental health by at least 25%, ensuring that by the end of the Parliament that the support is there, and 10% of our frontline NHS budget will be invested in mental health services. We will build on the success of the Community Link Work Programme to ensure every GP practice in the country has access to dedicated mental well-being link worker, creating a network of 1,000 additional dedicated staff who can help grow community mental health resilience and help direct social prescribing. And coming to the child mental health, we will also ensure the 1% frontline also goes to the CAMHS, supporting children and children's mental health and well-being. We will put in place a student mental health action plan as well to address waiting times, ensure equity of access to counselors, and embeds mental health and well-being into the curriculum.
Thanks very much, Rosa. So over now to Ross, Scottish Greens, 2 minutes, please.
Thanks. Sorry, the mute button there was a wee bit slow. The first thing that I would do in terms of pupils' mental health is give all school pupils a right to receive counselling in school. So at the moment in Wales, there's a requirement that in-school mental health counselling be available for all pupils. There's no requirement for that here. So we've made a lot of progress recently on the recruitment of more counsellors, but we're not in a place yet where that's actually a universal service provided to all young people. So the Greens would establish a right to in-school counselling. Wider than that, though, we want an additional £235 million for mental health, of which we'd put £160 million into child and adolescent mental health services, where the waiting times are just shocking and in some cases, unfortunately, deadly. We want to make sure that mental health support is available in every GP surgery. You should be able to get mental health support in your own local area, and the way to do that is through the GP surgery. But too often, people go to their GP only to be referred on to a waiting list somewhere else. We should have mental health professionals in all our GP surgeries. But if we want to tackle the root cause or causes of mental health problems, the major one is poverty. It's clearly not the only one, but the major one's poverty. You know, the Greens have already secured free school meals for all primary pupils. That'll be rolled out over the next year. We want to expand that to secondary pupils and to breakfast clubs as well. We secured COVID relief payments, cash support payments for low-income families, 500,000 low-income households of £330. We want to go further than that. We want to double the child payment. And we know that so many of the issues around poverty are connected to housing. So we would introduce proper, effective rent controls and a landlord watchdog, because so many people in our private rental sector are being driven further and further into poverty by their landlord. There's so much we can do directly in the provision of mental health services, but we need to tackle these root causes. Poverty is a major root cause. It's not the only root cause. But if we're serious about tackling that, it's about having a social security system worthy of the name and the creation of quality lasting jobs, not jobs that are paying poverty wages on insecure contracts.
That's time, Ross. Thank you. Over to Jeremy, Conservatives, please, 2 minutes.
Well, thank you again for the question. I mean, the ultimate answer to this is that we need to fund our services better. And we have failed to do that over the last 5 years. We haven't put enough money into mental health services, and the waiting lists before the COVID were very large. They've now become excessive. So I was talking to a lady this morning in Edinburgh at the school gates. Her son was diagnosed with ADHD last March, and she is still waiting for her son to be seen for her first appointment. That is totally unacceptable. If that individual had broken their leg at the school gate this morning, they would have been taken to a hospital, they would have had their leg fixed, and we would have been home with a plaster on it. So we clearly at the moment still have a view that we deal with physical illness in one way and we deal with mental health issues in a much less direct way. And I just think that has to be a change. So we need to put money into that, and we need to make sure that they are, and we have pledged to put millions extra into this service. Secondly, I think we have to look at other areas of why the attainment gap has broken down. We have seen some councils, so for example, Borders Council, before this COVID, had provided each pupil with an iPad. Now, why did that not happen 14 months ago? Why are we waiting for that as an election pledge? Why was that not rolled out so that every pupil? Now, not only do we need that, but we need proper broadband. Again, that has been delayed over and over again, and there are still lots of parts of Scotland which don't have acceptable broadband. And this, I suppose, ultimately comes down to what are your priorities within government. And we have seen local government funding cut year in, year out over the last 12 years. And that affects education, it affects mental health, it will increase the attainment gap. And that's why we need to fund local government much greater. Thank you.
That's time. Thanks, Jeremy. Karen, please, Lib Dems, 2 minutes.
Mental health is and has been for years and years and years one of our biggest priorities. And it's one of the things that we really want to invest in because it is ruining lives. I mean, if somebody has to wait a year to be seen by a mental health specialist, then and then maybe a year to get better, that's a third of their secondary education just gone like that. And I know that Larry Flanagan said that children will have been severely traumatised by the pandemic, but that school have been stripped of the staff needed to support them. So we're going to do something about that. We're going to get counsellors into schools. We're going to have mental health first aiders in every workplace for the staff as well. 15% of all new health spending will go straight into mental health. We, in the budget for this year, we secured £120 million more for mental health this year in the course of our budget negotiations. And, you know, we also want to encourage more people to retrain as counsellors. £1,000 grant, the costs of that. And I think
cut out there for a second,
one of the
Karen.
things that has been coming. Okay, am I back? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So one of the things that has been there's been an awful lot more of during the pandemic is people having eating disorders. So I think we really need to address that and and make sure that they get the treatment, because the intensity of the suffering and people have to wait a year to be seen by a specialist. That is just not acceptable. The waiting lists are huge, so people need to be seen as soon as possible. And I agree very much with what Ross was saying about poverty as a contributor to mental ill health. I kind of said in my opening statement about some of the things that we would do to address that. So I think that's
time, Karen.
For us.
That's time. Thank you very much. So next up, Michael, please, Labour, 2 minutes.
Thanks, and thanks, Georgie, for the question. I think you said you were a temporary teacher in Edinburgh, and one of the things we're committed to is ending unstable work for teachers. The 0-hour contracts that many people are sitting on in terms of whether it might be as supply, and for many of them, 0 hours means 0 hours, frankly. Not sitting on supply lists and never getting any work. So for teachers, that instability in work needs to stop. We have committed to increasing the mental health component of the NHS budget from 8.5% in Scotland to the average and the level in the rest of the UK, which is 11% over the parliamentary term. As part of our comeback plan for education, we've committed to a mental health assessment for every pupil as part of their personal comeback plan, so that we can support them not just in terms of their learning, but in terms of the holistic way around all their needs, because we know, and I think everybody on this agrees, that the extreme impact of lockdown has had on young people, and we need to get them the right kind of support. I think this has been described in part as a postcode lottery, and part of me wishes it was, frankly, as if, this is a national issue where actually right across the country we have a huge waiting lists. It's a national problem. We have thousands of children waiting to be seen, inordinate amounts of time. Karen's quite right in terms of how unacceptable those waiting times are. We have a situation, though, this isn't going to be easy to solve. We have no consultant psychiatrists in the pipeline, nor nowhere near enough. I know that there are facilities, again, in my local city of Dundee, where we have quite commonly have no consultant psychiatrists available at all. That results in a multi-million-pound locum bill. Now, that's poor planning on the part of the SNP government. We need to sort that out. And in the end, we need an economy that works for all if we're going to sort out the root causes of mental health.
Thanks very much, Michael. So over to the next topic, disability equality. So at a recent meeting of disabled members, we've heard about them facing significant discrimination at work, some also being actively discouraged from pursuing teaching as a career due to their disability or when they were open about being autistic. This shocking inequality cannot continue. Our next question here comes from Julie Ferguson.
I'm Julie Ferguson. I'm a deafblind science teacher in Orkney. My question here is, what steps will you take to remove the barrier to equality faced by disabled people of all ages? And how will you ensure disabled people are treated with dignity and respect in employment and in education?
Thank you so much to Julie for her question. So for this one, a further challenge to you as we're running out of time, 1 minute and 30 seconds, please, starting with Labour.
So on issues relating to social security and our benefit system, we're blessed in the Labour Party with having a fantastic lead spokesperson in this, and Pam Duncan-Glancy, who's an activist in Glasgow, herself a woman of disability, who has seen the hard end of this system and has put in place a whole raft of areas in terms of the kinds of reforms that we need to make sure that we have a social security system that's fit for purpose in Scotland. So I'm glad that much of the ability to change this was devolved through the Smith Commission, and that we have the opportunity now to actually deliver a system that works for people. I think the experience that you've outlined in terms of the systematic discrimination against disabled people in teaching is utterly shameful. And actually the diversity of voices and understanding disability for young people can only benefit from more disabled people in the classroom working with children and enhancing their learning, and we have much to do if we're to support that.
Thank you so much, Michael. You gave us 30 seconds there. For moving on to SNP, Rosa, please. 1 minute 30.
Hi, I work with disabled people in the constituency, and I understand how social security can affect people. And we have, with the powers that we have in Scotland, we have put in the child winter heating assistance, which is a £200 payment, which will help families out of poverty and especially from people who have disability living allowance. Also this year coming, child disability payment will start, followed by adult disability payment, which is much generous than what we have in place under the UK government. Also under the public sector equality duty, we will expand the specific duty that requires basically making sure that equal pay statements are given to people who are disabled, but also people with ethnicity, and equality all under all sections. We will be creating a learning disability, autism, and neurodiversity commissioner. And I think that would also help with mental health condition, people who have disabilities, and when treatment and care is required. These are a few things that I could mention within that time limit.
Thanks so much, Rosa. You're all being very good so far. Ross, Greens, please, 1.5 minutes.
Thanks. One thing that the Greens have already done is we passed changes to end the repeated and humiliating medical assessments that a lot of disabled people have to go through to access social security payments. So where those payments are devolved, the Greens have changed that system, so those repeated assessments are no longer necessary. We want to enshrine the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into law. We also want to see a commissioner, but we're not convinced on the remit that's been proposed around just autism and learning difficulties. I think that's narrow and a bit of an arbitrary combination. We want a wider commissioner for disabled people, neurodiverse people, all those with additional support needs. We want to see really improved transition planning for disabled people, disabled young people who are leaving education. There was a bill put forward at the end of the last term of Parliament, but it ran out of time, and we want that to be revisited, because I know from constituent casework just how much of a problem it can cause when the support suddenly ends and there's not an appropriate next step for a disabled young person. We also want to make the Young Person's Guarantee, that's a scheme that guarantees either a job or further education or employment to all young people. We want to make sure that's inclusive of disabled young people, so really rigorously monitor how many disabled young people are being able to access that. And finally, I want to make sure that additional support needs assistants are a registered profession. Too often in our schools, it's the lowest paid member of staff working directly with the children with the most complex needs. We need to make sure that that's a registered profession, probably with a further education qualification behind it, and registered with the GTCS.
Thanks very much, Ross. Over to Jeremy, please, Conservatives.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, a number of points to raise. I mean, I think firstly, as I said in my opening speech, I do think we need to revisit the whole issue of inclusion and how is that working for disability, because I just don't think it's working for many disabled children. I think the councils follow a methodology rather than look at the individual. I think secondly, we need to provide greater training for teachers around disability, on how we teach disability. My understanding, if I'm wrong, I apologise, that Murray House do one afternoon out of the 4 years on that. And that just seems to me too little. If you're off that afternoon, you could go through your whole time at college and not have disability training. So we need to get more of that. I agree again with Ross around the transition. I think it was a good bill. I think it was sad that it ran out of time, and it does need to be picked up by a cross-party group of MSPs, and we need to get that law implemented as soon as possible. And we, I think, need to look at what happens when people with disability, particularly hidden disability, go on to college, to make sure that the courses reflect what will benefit them, not just be courses which people think that might benefit them, and actually having a proper dialogue. And finally, we need to make sure that more disabled people are going into employment. Sadly, the gap is growing again, and so we have committed to set up a company owned by Scottish Government, which would guarantee disabled people training and opportunities to learn around employment. And I think
time,
again,
Jeremy. So sorry for cutting people off. Lib Dems, please, Karen, 1 minute 30.
Well, you know, as a mum of an autistic son, I bear the scars of trying to get proper support for him in school and beyond, and really making that transition as part, guaranteeing that transition plan is so important, so that you don't have this massive cliff edge at 18 where you go from getting lots of support to absolutely nothing. So, you know, really want an education service that is absolutely inclusive for every disabled child, so they get, you know, the appropriate care and support all the way through their education and beyond. We want to make disabled people a priority group for access to the Young Persons Guarantee and Employability Support Scheme. We want to carry out pay audits of government and local government and agencies to provide clear evidence of any unfair disadvantage experienced by disabled employees. And we want to kind of remove those employer-based barriers to disabled people. Suddenly everybody can work from home, which is what a lot of disabled people were wanting to do for a long time. And the pandemic has shown that we can do this, so we need to make sure that employers are flexible and there's a right for working hours and arrangements that recognises the individual needs. However, we also need to bake into that something that makes sure that disabled people and the people who maybe do the same for caring reasons are not cut out of workplace power structures. And you don't have decisions being made around the kettle in the office, but actually in you know, everyone's included.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's time. So we're moving on then to the last but not least LGBT inclusion section of this hustings. So I know we're running a little bit behind. We're due to be about 5 minutes late. I'm sorry to keep you 5 minutes over from your tea, but let's move swiftly on. So whilst acknowledging the pockets of excellent LGBT plus practice in educational institutions across Scotland, mainstreaming inclusive education has been further delayed by COVID-19. And this year's lockdown has also resulted in increased isolation and mental health issues by which LGBT young people are disproportionately affected. So our next question comes from EIS President Carol Thorpe.
Carol Thorpe, EIS National President and Aberdeen City Local Association. A 2019 poll showed that young people are more likely to be bullied for being lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender than in relation to any other protected characteristic, and that almost 3/4 of teachers said they had witnessed homophobic bullying in school. What steps does the panel feel must be taken to address this nationally in order to make school a fairer and better place for these young people?
Thank you so much to Carol for her question. So we'll go to Lib Dems first. Karen, please, and 1 minute 30 again for this. I do apologise.
Okay, great question. I think we really need to make the curriculum, I think, as wide as possible, and not just in citizenship education. Use diverse authors in English, because I think it's really important for young LGBT people to see people like themselves reflected in culture. One of the things I want to think about is, as a feminist and an LGBT activist for all my life, I do not see any conflict between women's rights and LGBT rights, and we really need to make sure that there's no place for transphobia in our education, and we need to make sure there's proper support in place for kids who are transitioning, and there needs to be proper training for teachers. And there's a huge difference between when a school just does the legal minimum that is required of them through gritted teeth, and when they actively support that young person and protect that young person from bullying. And I think we obviously need to implement the TIE campaign, mandatory LGBT inclusive education, and actually we need to talk about these issues much earlier. And I talked to a friend today who said he had one lesson in homophobic bullying in the 6th year, which is far too late, and also included quite a lot of homophobic bullying within that lesson. So we just need to make sure that we support people as much as possible, and that we make sure that we eradicate all forms of homophobic and transphobic and biphobic bullying.
Thanks, Karen. Over then to Michael, Scottish Labour, please.
I think the statistics that Carol quotes in the instances she quotes in her question are unfortunately not surprising, but still horrific. Because we know the impact that has on young people when they're going into a place where they should be feeling safe, feeling that they can express and develop as themselves and develop as a person, and that they find themselves cowed, shut down, and put in a box and made to feel bad about who they are. And that is the opposite of the kind of education experience that we want to have in Scotland. So I think you, in your introduction, Selma, you said, we know what we have to do in terms of the education and the mainstreaming of some of the approaches that have been taken. We just need to accelerate that and get on with it in terms of making sure that we have proper education, and we take a zero tolerance approach to issues of violence and bullying and discrimination. But we do, in Scottish Labour, support the TIE campaign and the great work that they've done. And I do think, again, we've come a long distance in the acceptance of that, in terms of that has to be the case across all our schools in Scotland. And we fully support that, and we need to move quickly on it, because it's unacceptable that our institutions and our young people are finding this on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Michael. Rosa, next, please, SNP.
Scotland has led the way in the fight for LGBT equality, and we're proud of our records. We've championed LGBT rights while in government. We have made progressive changes like the equal marriage legislation, a pardon for the historical homosexual offences, and equal civil partnership. I think it's important to tackle homophobia and transphobia and bullying and prejudice in schools, and the LGBT history, role models, and equality education is very, very important. And to achieve this, we have funded the Time for Inclusive Education to work with decision makers to produce a curriculum resources to deliver the TIE education. Yeah, I think these are all will make a difference to LGBT and equality in our communities. And we want to end conversation therapy. There's no place for conversation therapy in Scotland, and such practices are discriminatory and harmful to the mental and well-being of LGBT plus people. The UK government have committed to ban conversation therapy, as we do not have these powers equality powers, and we welcome this. However, if the UK government does not take action, we will bring forward our own legislation as soon as possible within the powers that we have in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Greens, Ross, please.
Thanks. I was one of many people who campaigned for the TIE campaign and its objectives around LGBT inclusive education, and we won. The argument was won. The government agreed, councils agreed, everyone who needed to agreed on the implementation of all of those campaign objectives, so including the accurate recording of homophobic and transphobic bullying, staff training, not just for teachers, all staff in a school need to make sure, we need to make sure that we've provided them with training on LGBT inclusion. There's a couple of areas I think we do need to go further though. So for a start, we need to rigorously monitor and make sure that that's all actually being implemented and funded properly, because the commitments have been made. Now it just needs to happen. We need to make sure there's training for PE staff in particular to make sure that PE and particularly the changing room environment is inclusive and not humiliating for trans and gender non-conforming young people. There's a lot more we need to do around PE in general for LGBT young people, I believe. But young people replicate behaviours that they see in wider society. And at the moment, trans people are being viciously persecuted here in Scotland. And predictably, that's turning into wider anti-LGBT hatred. And there should be a zero tolerance approach to that, including within all of our political parties and within Parliament. We need to transform healthcare for trans young people. The lack of quality physical healthcare is regularly leading to really poor mental health outcomes for young trans people. We need more training for GPs, but more funding for specialist clinics to reduce the huge waiting times. And we absolutely need to ban conversion therapy. That is unambiguously torture. And to be honest, we shouldn't wait for the UK government. We can act here in Scotland now.
That's time. Thank you. Jeremy, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, to state the very obvious at the very start, any form of bullying has to be stamped on, and that has to come from a head teacher across the whole, and that needs to be a cultural thing within the school. I think, again, there's probably quite a lot of cross-party agreement around these issues. I suppose for me, the two things to pick up on is firstly, the appropriate training for teachers so that they are trained to teach this, but also to understand the issues that are happening in the school as well. I think if I was a teacher, I would probably feel quite uncomfortable. It's not an area I have a lot of expertise on. And I think, particularly in secondary school, as I think was said earlier on, if you go on, if you're a history teacher or you're a maths teacher and suddenly you've been asked to teach this, you know, you will struggle with that perhaps initially. So you do need the training, and actually perhaps we do need a bit more expertise around that. So I think that is very key and important. And then for me, again, it is making sure that what we have decided is then followed through on. And that comes down to funding, and that making sure that local councils are funded appropriately by the Scottish Government, which has not been happening over the last number of years. So it is a funding issue, and it will be whether the money can get to the local authority and then onto the school. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to all speakers. I hope you do forgive me for the time limitations. And thank you so much to participants, those who submitted questions, and our EIS colleagues for organising this election. And long after, we as a union and our membership of dedicated educators across Scotland will continue to make the case for what is needed to deliver equality in education and beyond. And we hope that you all, if elected and your party represented here, will deliver and support us in this endeavour. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll let you get your tea.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.